Good morning. I'm Kristen Balasia, Head of Automotive Advisory at IHS Markit, and welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Mike Wall, Executive Director of Automotive Analysis, and Bjoern Huetter, Product Management Director. And we'll be discussing the rocky recovery as we progress through the second year of the pandemic. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Kristen.
Morning, Kristen.
So, gentlemen, the industry, we're here to talk about the rocky recovery. The industry was widely having a pretty good year through H1, even with some shocks and some challenges starting to build. When we look at H1 briefly and then talk about H2 and beyond, I can't help but think of a line from The Office, the US version of that TV show, when Andy says, "I wish there was a way to know you were in the good old days before you actually left them." And I think we may be able to classify H1 2021 as the good old days. So let's talk about the good old days before we jump to where we're sitting and where we're going. Mike, if we look back at what we saw in the global economy and the U.S. auto industry specifically during the first half of the year, how does it compare to 2020, and what are some of the key highlights?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's it's really interesting when you think about it. It's all about perspective. Coming off of 2020, an extremely challenging year. Long protracted shutdowns, turning off the world in terms of production for a good 7 to 8 weeks. We were really poised heading into 2021. The economic engines were rolling, firing on all cylinders, as it were, in many markets, not the least of which the U.S., certainly China, and and even Europe was starting to churn back to life. And what we saw in the first half of the year, just speaking from a North America and U.S. perspective, is sales were up 31% in North America. If you look at our resources and our global demand tracker, it shows that, boy, the recovery was well in hand, or at least the beginnings of that. And the beauty of this particular recovery was good in the sense that it was the demand-led recovery. Consumers were re-engaging the market. Whereas if you think back to 08, 09, it took time for that retail buyer to come back into market. It was a very challenging time back then with a credit crisis and really other challenges facing the market. You come back to now, and the consumer is back and re-engaging the market. However, again, this is something we'll be talking about throughout this podcast. There are still a lot of clouds out there. There's product shortages, component shortages. That is really the limiting factor. It's more a supply limitation rather than demand limitation right now.
Sure, for sure. And Bjoern, when you look at the rest of the world, specifically the major auto regions of China and Western Europe, what did we see the first half of 2021?
Well, it's been a bit similar picture to what Mike just painted. The major auto regions in the world, specifically Greater China, for example, being up 30.5% over H1 prior year. Likewise, Western Europe almost 30% up versus prior year. Now, in terms of kind of who's leading the ranks in terms of growth, now these are obviously the regions that got hit the hardest last year. So I would add to Mike's point, yes, it's consumer is back, but we must not forget about some regions that, despite the growth versus prior year, still going through some very challenging and difficult times. If you think of India, for example, here volumes have grown quite significantly, 66% versus prior year, but still going through or went through very challenging times in terms of managing COVID and how to deal with that in the first half year. Now, that continues, or that kind of growth continues as we look across other regions such as South America. Growth over prior year of close to 50%. Now, that kind of begs the question. I mean, who are the beneficiaries of that growth over prior year? And just I've made up myself a little ranking, again, using Global Auto Demand Tracker, and one of the beneficiaries, similar to last year actually, was Tesla. But if we look at also some of the more conventional, more established brands, then certainly the OEMs such as BMW and Toyota certainly, and Volkswagen have been able to benefit from that growth. You know, some I think it's fair to say that some other OEMs were a little bit more challenged, particularly in respect to global markets, and here to make up, you know, trying to make up for the loss that they have occurred last year. Are, for example, General Motors and Ford that, you know, could not quite compensate on a global scale what they've lost last year.
Yeah, and I think those are some great points. I mean, Mike, you mentioned this being, you know, a demand recovery, and the industry was really out in force in most markets, and it makes you wonder what H1 could have looked like if those constraints and headwinds hadn't started to kick up. And I think, Bjorn, that leads me to, you know, as the chip shortage continues, you mentioned, you know, BMW, Toyota. I mean, initially, a lot of people were able to kind of pivot and react and find ways around, you know, dealing with the shortage. But the industry continues not only to get pinched, but at this point, we've seen really no OEM go untouched. So why don't we talk about, Mike, some of the strategies that are being employed now that we've seen and likely in the future, as we know this is going to continue for a while.
Well, you're absolutely right. And Bjorn alluded to it too when he was referencing India. I'm mindful of the fact we're still not out of COVID yet. That's sort of been that second order impact of that longer lasting impact as well. So from a supply chain perspective, we had obviously the shutdowns creating sort of a ripple effect. In supply chain management, they call it a bullwhip effect, where these waves of impacts just flow through the industry. And automotive is a perfect example of that, where all it takes is a semiconductor chip not being available. All it takes is tightness in the area of steel or rubber or aluminum. It can literally bring an industry down, or certainly bring production down in that market. So suppliers are now wrestling with tightness in several different commodities. Of course, what gets all the press, rightfully so, because of the magnitude, is the semiconductor situation. And we've seen it on the one hand on the fabrication side, the wafer fabrication, that was the first order of tightness. And we've been starting to rebuild the capacity on that front and the availability to automotive. But then, as Bjorn was alluding to with India and the COVID lockdowns, we've seen in Southeast Asia the return of COVID lockdowns, and that's impacted what are called the back-end operations of chip manufacturing, which would be testing, fabrication, assembly, packaging. And that is what's giving us just all sorts of problems right now in terms of availability of chips, and really, frankly, impacting our production almost more meaningfully to the negative than what it did in Q1 and Q2 of this year.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting to see is the OEMs that normally deal with their supplier community, their tier ones, their systems providers, they're really having to get more intimate with lower levels in the supply chain and starting to establish those relationships and make those commitments and really put their weight and force behind you know, supporting their needs. And I think it is going to be a little bit of a shift, especially as all of these vehicles are, you know, continue to require even more and more, you know, semiconductors and technology, et cetera. It's no longer going to be a tier 2, 3 type relationship. I think that will really, the gap will close quickly, and they're learning the hard way. So Bjorn, you know, in addition to the chip shortage, there's other supply challenges being faced by OEMs, and amongst all of this, right? And now it's just become kind of commonplace discussion, but the mass introduction of electric vehicle, new players in the market, the changing portfolios that traditional OEMs are having to deal with and their massive investments. You know, what are we seeing there? And you know, maybe just comment a little bit about the dynamics with that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, certainly and I alluded to some of the more established kind of traditional manufacturers. I mean, for a number of years, they are going through this transformation, and just, you know, it's really just been in the last 1 to 2 years where they kind of officially gave out, you know, when they no longer want to be producing internal combustion engines. So that certainly is going to stay with us for well, a number of years. But it's also interesting to see kind of you know, what's going on the new vehicle entrants, such as Tesla, for example, which you could almost reference as a more established brand. But certainly, when we look at the kind of just the number of brands that are in battery electric vehicles only. Now these are coming predominantly from China, off of the back of NEV, so new electric vehicle subsidies. But there are a number of challenges there, such as NIO, for example, that have really started to mass manufacture and mass market, obviously, the NEV vehicles in China, but are now making inroads into other markets. Looking at demand tracker, we could see how NIO is now set foot in Norway. Little numbers for now, but that is expected to grow as they progress into other Western European markets as well. And there's certainly more to them. I mean, there's certainly a proliferation of electric-only brands going on. The next ones to mention certainly are Lucid and Rivian entering mass production shortly. And recently it was made official that the Chinese brand that is predominantly known for technology and mobiles, Xiaomi, is also entering or is intending to enter the electric vehicle space. So certainly a space to watch there, very, very dynamic to what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, Mike, new market entrants or long-standing market player, there's forces at play that everyone's going to have to contend with. Can you talk a little bit about that at maybe a broader level?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right. Whether you're new or old, to some extent, you're all facing the same challenges. If you're an automaker, it's about learning to do more with less inventory, a reshaped supply chain, as you were alluding to earlier. What was once a tier 2 or a tier 3 may suddenly become your best friend in a new tier 1. So that's something that we're going to have to wrestle with in the extreme near term, and then in the intermediate to longer term, or even right now as well. This whole transition to electrification, obviously, is something that automakers are going to have to navigate, and it's very similar on the supply chain as well, in the sense that, look, trying to understand the take rates for electrification and how that progresses in different regions, or even in some of your major market regions, is going to be critical. And from a supplier, having to understand, how do I make money on low volume runs on an electrified vehicle, at least to start, versus protecting my cash cow or protecting where I'm making money on maybe traditional internal combustion engine vehicle variants, is going to be something to certainly navigate. And then again, from a supplier perspective as well, is trying to navigate the here and now. Again, the near-term production outlook is going to be fraught for the next again 12 to 18 months or better. And it's something that suppliers and automakers alike are going to have to navigate, as we kind of covered both the tactical side and then the strategic side, which is more reflective of this, again, ongoing wave of electrified activity coming down the pike.
Yeah. So final questions for each of you. So Bjorn first, how would you recommend that our clients, the industry, stays on top of this rapidly changing environment and market conditions? I know us as forecasters, we have those same things. We get questions and we say, you know what, changes used to change every month and every week. Now almost every day and hour, something can change. So how do we stay on top of that, Bjorn?
Yeah, very good point. I mean, it's the situation is extremely dynamic, as we've touched on a number of times during this conversation, and really that is also a challenge to us as forecasters, because there are just so many variables that need to be taken into consideration. Now, specifically, I mean, what is that clients can do? Well, I mean, to keep abreast of the latest developments, it's certainly important to have at their disposal tools that can help with making sure that whatever the latest developments around the world, clients do keep abreast of that. And I do think that within IHS Automotive, we have a number of solutions to assist with exactly that need, be it the sales side and how different regions across the world are developing, be it wanting to stay very close to electrification trends, and yeah, I think we have a number of things in our toolkit to assist clients with that challenge.
And Mike, I'm going to end where I started. So I mentioned maybe H1 were the good old days we didn't realize we were leaving. Are we sitting again in the good old days we don't realize we're leaving? What can we expect for the rest of the year and into 2022? How happy should we be now?
Yeah, H1 is going to probably feel like the good old days for a little bit yet. So we are faced with, I think, for the next 12 to 18 months are going to be some very, very choppy waters. And it's ironic to kind of say that, or kind of frame out, 2022, is it a write-off year? I wouldn't call it a write-off year by any stretch, because it's going to be an important transitional year. But we're going to be poised to see continued volatility. I guess that would be the biggest theme. So flexibility is going to be the watchword, whether it be a supplier or an automaker or any other industry stakeholder. I mean, one of the best things to say is we're going to be setting ourselves up for the new good old days when they come. They're just a little bit more deferred, and that's the key takeaway. I'm reminded of the quote, "This too shall pass." It will pass. We will get to a point where we have more sustainable, sustained recovery and demand and production. But we've got some more tunnel to go through, and that's really what these next, again, probably good 12 months to 18 months are going to be. It's going to be heightened volatility and again, navigating some of these challenges yet that are to be placed upon us.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, Bjorn, thank you so much. Always interesting to talk to you both, and in these very interesting times. We'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt in to our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, visit ihsmarket.com/auto newsletter.